I'm Owen from D20. This is going to be the first of the rant videos that I spoke about a little while ago. I'm going to be putting these out every now and then as a way of exploring my, let's call them unpopular opinions. But I'm not going to jump straight into the really deep stuff. Today I'm going to start with something related to Magic the Gathering, because that's something that most of you guys will know me from. I used to run D20 Geeking Venue up in Joburg, where we used to run a lot of Magic events. We ran a FNM, a Friday Night Magic, every week, as well as a few other events around the time. In fact, our last FNM was quite popular. I think we had 42 players, the very final FNM before D20 Geeking Venue closed its doors. So Magic has been an important part of my life for the last few years, and specifically, I have a slightly different experience of Magic than most people do. Most people experience Magic as a player. You'll go from tournament to tournament and compete in the different events and try that kind of thing. I've experienced it very differently. I've only ever played in a couple of tournaments that I didn't run myself. For the vast majority of the events that I've run, or that I've participated in, and we're talking literally thousands of Magic events, I've been the tournament organizer of just about every single one of them. And that's a very different experience than of what most people have of the Magic scene, and I think that might give me some interesting insights that you guys might find useful. So today I'm going to talk about how to choose the deck for the tournament that you're going to play in. Some people just select their deck based on what format the tournament is. Is it Commander? Is it Standard? Is it Modern? And just grab the nearest deck and head out the door. And I tend to think that that's probably not enough. Maybe you should be putting a little more thought into it than that. So let me use an example from another aspect of life. When you're getting dressed in the morning, you don't just throw on whatever you grab out of the cupboard. You obviously have to think about what your plans are for the day. If you're going into work, if you work in a corporate job, odds are you have to wear maybe a suit and tie or something like that, or at least shirt sleeves and long pants and proper shoes. So that's what you put on when you go to work. Or if you're going to the beach that day, you might put on shorts and flops. Or if you're just hanging around the house and playing video games, then you might put on some sweatpants and some thick warm socks. Those are the clothes that you put on because they're based on what's appropriate for the activities that you're engaging in that day. And I think that the same rules can apply when you're playing in Magic, and to a certain extent that's informed by the format of the event, whether it's Modern, Standard, or Commander. But I think that there are more considerations that people tend to neglect when they're choosing what deck they're going to be playing in a given tournament. For example, at D20 we used to run, as I said, the Modern FNMs every Friday. They were sometimes very popular, and we had a lot of Modern players who came and enjoyed playing their games there every week. But what I noticed was that some of the people weren't getting as much from the experience as others. And the ones who weren't getting the best experience were the players who tended to end up at the bottom of the ladder at the end of the night, and also those who tended to end up at the top of the ladder at the end of the night. The guys in the middle had the most fun. The guys at the top and the bottom tended to have a bad time. Now you can understand the guys at the bottom of the ladder having a bad time, because what that means is they've lost every game that they've played that night, and that's, although it's not about winning or losing necessarily, it's about playing the game. You kind of also want to win sometimes, so it kind of sucks to lose. And at D20 we had a policy of making sure that everybody left a tournament with something in their hands. So even the guy who came dead last won something. It wasn't as cool as the first prize, but at least there was something. He had something to show for his participation that night, that he'd put in the effort, he'd shown up, he'd put his clothes on, he'd brought his deck, and he'd played, and he'd stayed until the end. And that I thought was worthy of recognition. Even if the recognition wasn't as much as first place, at least it was something. But what was a little strange was that the guys at the top of the ladder sometimes were having an unenjoyable experience, or at least a less fun experience. And I tried to explore that with a few of the guys, and they explained to me what was going on. They found that when they were playing against players who had, let's say, less powerful decks. So that's either new players who just taken to the game and hadn't had a chance to assemble decks that were competitive in the Modern format, or perhaps it was other players who'd been playing for a while but either didn't have the resources or the time or frankly the skill to put together decks that were competitive in the Modern format. And they were satisfied with bringing those decks week after week and playing those jankier, more interesting decks that weren't necessarily able to win in the Modern format. Modern, for those who don't know, is a format of Magic that incorporates an enormous card base. It's not the entire Magic card base back to the very beginning, but it goes back in 10, 12 years, something like that. So we're talking thousands of different cards. But that card base changes very slowly. Every time a new set is introduced, those new cards are added to the card base. But now there's such a huge library of cards in that base that even the new sets don't make that much of a difference to the established meta. A modern deck can have been built 5 years ago and be as strong then as it is today, because the meta doesn't really change. It's what they call a solved format. There's maybe a dozen or so different basic decks that you can build. You get the list online and you get hold of the cards. You can build those decks and you're guaranteed to perform relatively well. And sitting down at the table, if you have a mono red burn deck and your opponent has a storm deck, you know who's going to win. You know how that's going to go, and you know what cards they're going to bring in from their sideboard in the second game and so on. Some people like the certainty, the predictability of that in the competitive level of Modern. But more casual players tend to play more random stuff. They're not playing those tier 1 decks. They're just throwing together whatever they think is fun from the collection they have, and not necessarily spending a lot of money on buying the key components for those tier 1 decks. And they're just having fun, because the other advantage of having such a wide card pool for Modern is that you can just have fun decks. My favorite deck, for example, is a green-white, what I call my repeater deck. It works off the Roaring Primadox. I have a bunch of green-white creatures that have Enter the Battlefield triggers, and the Roaring Primadox is bouncing them back to my hand every turn, and I have to resummon them and re-trigger those Enter the Battlefield effects. It's great fun, and once it gets up and going, it does some really cool stuff. But it's kind of slow at the start, so it's just not competitive in competitive Modern. It can't keep up. So I have a Boros Burn deck that it kind of does okay in competitive Magic some of the time, depending on the matching. So these top performing Magic players, these Modern players, were having a dodgy time playing against the less experienced players, because they found that when they arrived with their tier 1 decks, they sat down and they would win in 3 turns. Their opponent was just sitting there mystified, having no idea what had just happened. They'd had a bad experience. Their opponent had had a bad experience. Not only had they lost, but they felt like at no point did they ever have a chance in turning it around. They felt like they'd been steamrolled and completely obliterated by this opponent that clearly had them outmatched. Now, that's fine. Insofar as Magic is a competitive game, you want to be the winner, but you also don't want to have that bad experience for your opponent. You don't want to feel like you're playing out of your league. So here's when the considerations come in that I've been trying to get at here. Is when you're considering the tournament, it's not going to go and play in the tournament. It's not necessarily enough to just think about the format. Is it Modern or is it Standard? You kind of need to think about, what's the venue? What's the prize support? What's the tone? What's the culture of the place that I'm going to? Who's going to be there? Who am I going to be playing against? What's the level of competition we're looking at? If the stakes are high, if we're talking about a major Modern tournament where there's a huge cash prize, or maybe it's a qualifier into one of the international championship events or something along those lines, then obviously you want to bring your A game. You want to bring your most powerful deck, because you're going to be playing against other players who have similarly powerful decks. But if it's just an F&M at your local gaming store, and there's going to be inexperienced players, and they're not going to be playing at a competitive level, and they might not want to play at a competitive level, they might be quite happy playing their mid-range jank, perhaps it's worth reconsidering bringing your tier 1 deck. Maybe it's time that you built yourself a little mid-range jank deck, or maybe you still have one lying around from your early days playing. Maybe you have a fun deck that doesn't really work competitively, but is still cool to play. Maybe that's the deck you should be bringing to that casual Modern F&M, instead of your huge Eldrazi or Eldrazi-tron, something like that. Maybe the fun little green-white Roaring Primadox repeater deck. Maybe that's the right choice. These competitive players, while I can perfectly understand the desire to be competitive, all they're doing is they're ruining their own night, and they're ruining the night for some other player or players that they're coming up against by bringing an overpowered deck. They're bringing a gun to a knife fight. And I don't think it's really all that appropriate. Now, I certainly understand if you're a competitive level player, you want to be able to play at the competitive level all the time. But it's really not necessary, is it? Is that the only way to enjoy playing Magic, is to play at the top tier competitive level? Is it really worth playing 3 or 4 games against opponents that you have vastly overpowered, only to get to the last round or two where you're finally playing against opponents who perhaps match your skill level, or at least match the quality of your deck? Is it really worth it to ruin that night for yourself and for other players, just for the sake of getting out that cool combo? Isn't it more fun to sit across the table and have a chat? I don't know. I'm not judging. If it really is up to you, winning the game is the most important thing for you. That's cool. I don't judge that. Or perhaps you've just built yourself a new tier 1 deck and you want to practice it. You want to make sure that it works. That's cool too. It depends on what your goals and your objective is. What I'm advocating here is not that you shouldn't ever bring your tier 1 deck to a casual event. Far from it. I think that there's nothing wrong with bringing some power to a casual event. All I'm asking is that you, as a professional player or as a mid-range player or any other kind of player, think about the tone and the kind of play that's going to be happening at the event, not just the format. Think about more considerations. Who are you going to be playing against? What's the environment? What's the vibe? And base your decision on more factors than just whether or not it's modern or standard. Well, that's it for this week. If you have some other topics that you'd like me to rant about, please drop those in the comments below. You can rate, comment, subscribe, do all of those kinds of things. And if you'd like to hear more of this kind of thing, I want to know about that. You can support me on Patreon so that I've got more time to put this kind of content out. It's been interesting, and watch out for more of these rant videos in the future where I'll be expressing even more of my unpopular opinions. Next week we should have another Star Trek apologetics up, and that's going to be cool. Another rant probably in 2 weeks' time. And I'll see you guys around the internet. SWAT out.